development material, the material that, you know, we are not always able to take a deeper look at in our regular classroom and training environments. And of that particular brainstorm, we have many coming forward for you. I think they'll all be enjoyable. They'll all be informative. This one, risk management in particular, is something that I hold near and dear to my heart. I see a couple of the attendees have actually been at my risk management presentations in the past, and I hope you find that this one is has built upon the many lessons that we've learned over the years. I've had the opportunity and the luck, really, to be able to teach this topic to particular trade groups and particular small boat captains for about 16 years. And we really started off teaching this, and it was a concept that we understood, but the training and the formalization of it was something that wasn't done quite as often at the small boat level. We were well into the 21st century before there were any books on bridge resource management for single vessel operators, right? Now, if you think about that, how many single vessel operators do we have around the nation? And how many of them have, had a wholehearted formalized approach towards managing the resources while on the bridge? And one of those that holds near and dear to my heart is the risk management. So let's go into a discussion of, in my years in the towing and salvage business and in the tugs and towing business, and then as my career advanced into owning and operating what's essentially a small trade school, and doing work as an expert in the small boat field, I've had the opportunity to see a lot of bad decisions get made, and I've had the opportunity to see the result of those bad decisions generally up close. And as you ponder the thought, you're like, well, how can we help people? How can we help people make a better decision? I think the first thing that we want to look at is where are we seeing bad decisions? As I said in the introduction to this course when we emailed you about it, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? There's not many bad decisions that I've seen that have been bad on purpose, right? Most of them were a complete accident, and most of them were done by people who were doing a good job or were trying their best to do a good job. And so, where are these bad decisions coming from? I've sort of compiled some thoughts that I have about them. I'll share my screen with you here. Let me just move. I need to move a few windows around here, so bear with me just one moment. Okay. Can you guys just nod your head if you can see my screen? Great. So when we're talking about bad decisions, let's talk about how the real cut and dry, the super simple way to make a bad decision. First thing you got to do is wake up in the morning. It is at that point where the gate to bad decisions opens. You haven't even gotten to the office yet. It might even just depend on what side of the bed you got at, whether you're having a good day or a bad day, whether you've got a good night's rest. For whatever reason, on days that I'm driving boats professionally, my radar for bad decisions starts the moment I get out of bed. And it sounds silly, but if you start to think back upon some of your, hopefully not very recent, but previous past decisions, you could probably pretty quickly trace things back there. And the second step I found in making a bad decision is shooting from the hip. Now, I think we're expected to think on our toes. And I think there's a big difference between thinking on your toes and actually shooting from the hip, right? Just because you have to think quickly or think on your feet doesn't mean that things can't be formalized in their process. It doesn't mean that your decision-making can't be, that it can't be a little more in depth than just, well, let's try this and see what happens. Decisions and actions that are used based on emotion or clouded judgment goes a long way towards bad decision making. Not just because you're angry. It doesn't, it's everybody's, said or done something they regret when they've been frustrated. More like, if you have the woe is me, oh, I've been working too hard, or oh, I can't believe they got me back out here, or oh, this weather's terrible, when is it gonna lighten up? Those sort of things that that sort of promulgate complacency or just general poor mindset, where perhaps the decisions that you're gonna be generating at that point aren't as effective as they could be, and your judgment could be slightly clouded by the same. And I think we tend to want to be right as a society. We want to be right, and we want to be right fast. And so whether we're operating a boat or driving a car or at home or in a group of people, or you see it on social media all day long, and that we want to be right, and we want to be right quickly. And I suppose that's okay, but oftentimes you're more right when you look at all of your facts, when you look at all of your data, when you put off making a decision or generating an action until you know more details, until you've asked more questions. That can relate back to carrying passengers. It can relate back to towing boats in. It can relate back to catching fish. Sort of all of the above. Hey, we're going to make some decisions here, but do we really know all of the factors that are going to affect our safety? The devil's in the details, right? And I look at the for example, out on the West Coast, the Conception. I mean, who would have thought that a bunch of rechargeable batteries would create such a terrible accident, right? But there was data there was facts, there was things to look at and see and be concerned about, right? And when the Coast Guard, when the Coast Guard sees bad decisions get made, the Coast Guard likes to, essentially eliminate bad decisions with training, because mandating training is sort of a way that box can be checked. My goal, my hope for professional boat captains nationwide, particularly on small boats like we work with, is that the training will never need to be mandated, because we're regulating ourselves through doing things like making good decisions and putting stops in place that keep us from making bad decisions. And you want them to be if possible, even documented. Right? Many of us know that if it's not written down on boats, then really it never happened. So a concrete way to make decisions, but also to acquire as much knowledge as you possibly can before you do that. Particularly if you're newer in the field, or you're a younger, less experienced operator. So, another area for easy mistakes that I've seen is misinterpreting the big picture, knowing where you are in your job and how all of that fits together, and your level of importance and all of the above. And there's a time to be out in front, and there's a time to let others through, and understand that the big picture, what your impact is on the big picture, may be more than you originally thought, and generating more of a positive or negative response, and it might very well be less. But a misinterpretation of it generally leads to a higher level of potential for bad decision making. And then a misunderstanding of your role, or the importance of your role, or the necessity of your role, is another sort of opportunity that I've seen where people can generally start to make bad decisions. So that's a lot of information, to take in at once. We do record this, and I'm available for further dialogue and further discussion. But the crux of the program here, right, is not just, how to make a bad decision. It's to identify areas where decision making can be negatively impacted, and then look at ways to put stops there and ways to prevent that from happening. And that's called risk management. And in essence, what we're trying to do is make good decisions all day long, even if you have to think on your feet, even if your conditions are unpleasant, even if you're in a situation that creates unpleasant emotions, even if you're in a situation where perhaps you're tired and not well rested, but your obligation to bat 1,000 still exists, whether that's fair or unfair. Because at the end of the day, we're really only as good as our last job. And so, a wholehearted approach towards risk management is something that I encourage everybody to take. So that being said, just my little presentation on how to make a bad decision based on, having analyzed a lot of bad decisions and seeing where they're coming from. More importantly, let's not make bad decisions. Let's use proper risk management. Okay. And I'm going to turn it over to Captain Kit. She's going to discuss more on the risk management side of things with some really beautiful courseware that she's put together.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Be here and talk a little bit with you all about some of the nitty gritty of risk management. So we'll jump into that with some assessment. What does this mean? So Kent, you can go ahead. I think you have to advance for me. Essentially, a risk assessment is a way to make good decisions. So Kent's described lots of ways that over the years that people are making poor decisions. We want to do the complete opposite of that and take a really good look at what we're doing, assess our risks. And I want you to think about it too, not just in terms of a one and done, but really that risk assessment cycle. So we're identifying hazards and risks, we're reviewing them, we're analyzing them, we're thinking about how they might impact our work. Then we're working to control, and we're putting risk controls in place. We're evaluating the success of what we just did. And that helps us go into the next iteration of identifying hazards and risks and reviewing and controlling. And eventually we're going to just continue to improve our safety, our efficiency, and our management of various situations. So we'll start looking at hazards. And I think we all know what a hazard is. It's just good to have a common definition here. It's something that has the potential to cause harm or loss. In worst cases, a hazard can lead to illness, death, injury, damage to property, damage to the environment, or interruptions to operations. So loss of money, liability, all of those things. Those are our hazards. So to take a step further and look at what risk is, it's the interplay of the hazards with the likelihood that they might happen and the severity of that hazardous occurrence taking place. So likelihood is probability. How likely is this to happen? Severity is the level of consequence. How bad would it be if it did happen? So when we go to look at the big picture, you can go ahead. We've got this relationship where we identify our hazards, we weigh, we measure the severity. If this thing happened, how bad would it be? The likelihood that it could happen. And that's where we land on our risk. So this is a really nice relationship to just have in your mind. Step one is identify hazards. Then you want to be thinking about likelihood, severity, and that's where you're landing on your level risk, your measurement, your assessment. There's a really handy tool I wanted to show you all. You may well be, but if you're not, it's nice to refresh as well. This is what's known as a risk matrix. And sometimes these things are so engineered, you might have, 5 columns and 10 rows and like really, really detailed, granular look at risk. But this is a super simple version, and it allows us to really get a handle on what we're talking about. You can see the likelihood in the left-hand column there. You can see across the top the severity or the consequence of a risk. So I'm going to take something really simple. Let's use the example of some grease on the deck of the boat. That's a hazard. When it's sitting there on the deck, it's a hazard. What's the likelihood that someone's going to slip in that grease? Well, if it's right in the middle of a companionway, it's pretty likely. So I'm looking at a high likelihood or likely. And if you want to talk about the probability involved with these measurements, unlikely is kind of 0 to 33% happening. Likely is 33 to 66. and highly likely is over 66% chance that that might happen. So let's say it's a 50-50, someone could slip. I'm going to put that in the likely category. Now, how harmful would a fall be? Someone could get injured, they could sprain a wrist, they could hurt their back, they might even fall overboard. So harmful, pretty harmful. So at the most moderate end of that analysis, we're going to land right in the middle there with a score of 4. It's likely to happen, and the potential consequence is harmful. So it's a moderate risk. And if you look at the bottom of that slide there, any outcome in yellow, orange, or red is what we would consider high risk. And essentially what that means is that you need to manage that situation. You cannot let that grease sit there on the deck. You need to take action right away, clean it up. If you're landing in the red, if you have a highly likely situation with extreme harm as a potential outcome, you're in the intolerable risk zone. And what that means is A, you don't start that operation at all, or B, you put a halt to it and you put controls in place and you carry on with your work, hopefully at a lessened risk rate. So that's a very simple tool you can think of, even just mentally, you can picture that or jot it down or have a copy handy on board and think about, is this low risk? In which case I carry on. Maybe I'm just assessing all the time, making sure my risk levels aren't changing. Or is it falling into the yellow, orange, or red zone where I need to put some controls in place as soon as possible, if not stop what I'm doing immediately. Also, keep in mind that risk may not be as simple as impacting health, welfare, or the vessel itself. It may well have larger consequences. Risks can run the gamut. They can be impacting vessel operations. They can impact vessel equipment. They can impact people. The environment, maybe you have a tank of fuel sitting near the railing. That's a hazard. Is the lid on well? Is it secured? If it's not, there's a likelihood that thing could go overboard. And now we've made a bad decision because we haven't lashed it down. We haven't checked the lid. And we might have the result of having a pretty bad environmental impact there. Reputational risks. These are more and more an issue. Everybody in the world is carrying a phone with a camera, with the ability to take video, to post that on social media. So you're running a risk of damaging your reputation. That could impact your bottom line. Maybe you're going to lose visitor revenue. An accident can cost money, so you have a risk of costs going up, or insurance issues. So risks are really running the gamut of all different aspects of what it is we're doing out there on the water. So that big picture is important to keep in mind when you're identifying risks and hazards. So I've mentioned controls a couple times here, and I want to zero in on that for a minute. This is a nice model. Again, just building yourself a mental picture. You can think of the star, and these are different ways that you can control risk. The biggest overall goal that we want to have is reducing that risk. We want to eliminate it as much as possible, reduce it as much as possible. Some of the ways that we can get there are potentially to spread the risk out. Let's say you have a really complicated, intricate job. It's going to take you hours. The longer you're out there on the water, the more prone you are to weather coming in. Risk is going to start to play a real factor in something like that, a complicated, faceted job. How can we spread out the risk? Well, maybe we can increase the amount of time that we're giving ourselves to do the job. That's going to lessen risk. Maybe we can bring in other assets. We can bring in other boats. We can bring in other people to help us. So we're dispersing the risk. We're spreading it out. We might also choose to transfer the risk. And if we do that, we might look towards someone who's more experienced or a boat that's better outfitted for whatever the job is that we might have to do. So we're going to transfer the risk, hopefully to a better situation. Avoiding the risk, that's ideal. That could be as simple as putting on a PFD so that the risk of drowning is gone from whatever job it is you're involved in. Avoiding could also be simply waiting for daylight to come along. Maybe you're tasked to do something in the dark and it's too risky in the dark. So we're going to avoid that risk by just simply waiting for the sun to come up. There is the option also with risk to just accept it. And obviously that's not a great scenario if you're dealing with some high risk measurements, some of those highly likely, highly impactful outcomes. We only want to accept risk when the benefit of the action outweighs the potential risk. And that's a difficult decision to make. So that's something you're really going to want to think about, plan, make sure you've exhausted every other option before you get there. So that's your STAR risk control options. Keep in mind, no risk, no activity entirely free of risk. Everything we do has a little bit of risk involved. An activity is considered safe when risk levels are within acceptable limits. So a good adage to keep in mind, when you can remove risk, do it. When you can't remove it, reduce it. If I can, I just want to share a story with you all. My background is in expedition cruising. I've driven Zodiacs, so small open boats with a tiller, and I've worked all over the world. I've visited 130 countries and territories plus. I've seen all kinds of conditions and worked single-handed in small boats, often in some pretty hairy situations. And I like this story because it demonstrates risk controls and how they can be put in place. I was working in the South Pacific in an island setting. We were coming into a very small harbor, and it did have a little jetty. And essentially the channel going in and out of the harbor was nothing more than coral reef that had been blasted out. So it was very narrow. Maybe two boats could pass going, opposite directions, but barely. And we had a pretty significant swell running that day, and we needed to land our guests inside the small harbor. So our expedition leader, he took a look at that situation and he brought us all in. We had a briefing, we had a meeting. He said, these are the conditions, this is the situation. What are we going to do to control the risks here? And what we ended up doing, and it was very thorough, we set up a safety boat outside the reef, so outside where the waves were breaking. That safety boat carried a tow rope. It had an extra person on board, so there were two of them out there in the safety boat. We also had an extra hand inside our small Zodiacs, so 5-6 meter Zodiacs. We had two people instead of our usual one, so an extra operator there in case something went wrong. We also had a lookout on the end of the harbor wall so that person could be looking at the waves. And essentially our job was to time the sets and pass while there was a lull between sets. And everything had been going really well all day. Our communications were fantastic. We were refreshing drivers as much as we could. So we were eliminating the risk of people being tired or burned out or losing focus. Human error, gosh, that's a huge risk factor. So that's something to keep in mind. But we still had an accident. And actually I was the operator. As I was going out, I encountered a set I was not expecting. I thought I had a lull. I did not. I timed it incorrectly. And a pretty big, powerful wave kept growing. And I ended up just punching out and over it. We were fine. Everyone was fine, but we came down really hard on the backside. And I had a lady who thought she might have hurt her back. Long story short, the rescue boat was there. He put a tow line on us immediately, towed us out of the impact zone. We had the doctor on standby on board the ship. We had everything dialed in because we had done that risk assessment at the beginning of the day, took into account our situation. And even with all those controls in place, still had an accident, albeit minor, but it could have been a very different situation had we not had the forethought and the insight to manage those risks and control them as much as we could. So just a little anecdote to help frame all of that for you guys. I think there's one more slide. And to come back to that, human error, as I mentioned, it does play a big part in our risk assessments, and lapses in memory, slips, trips, falls, all of these things happen. So our best antidote is situational awareness. And I'm sure you've heard this, it's such a buzzword in the industry now. I love this very simple definition from the Coast Guard: know what's going on around you. Accidents are less likely to happen when we're not paying attention, when we're not looking at our surroundings, we're not looking at the sky and watching the weather changes, we're not looking at approaching hazards. So the onus is on us as small boat captains to be vigilant, to make sure our crews aren't tired, to do everything we can to have our the pulse of the situation that we're in the moment. And the ultimate question that you're asking yourself with a risk assessment and risk management is, can this be done safely? Ask yourself that question all the time. Ask your teams that question all the time. Use the risk analysis, that risk assessment process, to question. Use your risk matrix. If you're really interested in this process, I recommend the Coast Guard uses GAR worksheets. It's green, amber, red. And again, it's just another tool for measuring risk and classifying it. So that's a great resource for you. And I'm a huge fan of briefings and debriefings, because that's where we get each other talking and encouraging communication. This is where ideas come out, assessments take place. And also they're a wonderful tool for learning. We can share our what went well and why. We can share our what didn't go so well and how to improve it for next time. And then everybody on the team makes a commitment to apply those lessons learned to the next operation, the next mission, the next time we're out on the boat. And just my takeaway lastly here is that safety concerns should carry more importance, as much importance as the need to complete the assigned task on time. So it's sometimes very hard to step away from the pressure of our jobs, the commercial pressure, and take a breath and say, you know what, I'm being pressured to get this done, but I need to do it safely. And hopefully now you have a little bit more understanding of some of the tools involved in making sure that you're assessing your risks and doing a safe job. So that's my piece of the puzzle.
Kit, that was awesome. And kudos to you for sort of telling that sea story. You know, if you really want to make, a group of professional boat captains quiet, you know, put them all at the table and say, well, who's going to tell their own sea story about risk management where they made a mistake? You know, nobody really, you know, there's be a lot of looking around like, doesn't want to, you know, we all have them. Every single person.
We all have them. And I made that mistake. My understanding of that is that I can now help other people learn from that mistake. Right, you know, and so it has value. Every mistake we make has value in a lesson, being a lesson that we can learn from. So thanks for that.
One thing that I had thought about, just something that we've taught in the past, and you know, we teach a lot of things, so you just had forgotten. It came back to me as I was listening to Kit, was when we were talking about the expense of an incident or an accident, and just a simple iceberg analogy, right? So you can see about 10% of an iceberg above the surface of the water. Well, if you have an accident, you know, let's say we're carrying passengers and somebody gets injured, and then it's a $1 million claim. Okay, that $1 million is a direct cost of that claim, and it represents about 10% of the total cost of the accident. So $1 million accident in the long run, when you talk about downtime, investigation time, loss of reputation, loss of goodwill amongst your customers, the legal fight, etc. It's like a $10 million. It's like a $10 million mistake, you know, so the numbers add up really quickly there. And that had come to my mind as Kit was talking through that. So we're lucky today in that we have our friend and associate John Fulweiler here, who has a great perspective as a Newport-based maritime attorney. So let me just move my screen around here. John, let's turn it over to you. And can we get some of your professional insight onto this and what sort of the small boat captains can perhaps be looking out for on the legal side of things?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a risk is such an interesting topic and so focused on what we do. As Ken said, my name is John Fulweiler, and my maritime practice here in Newport is really focused on claimants, crew and passengers that are injured. And so if you were to listen and perform and do everything that Ken has suggested, I would be out of business, because my business relies on the fact that you are not going to do a hazard analysis, you're not paying attention to risk, and you have plundered ahead and you either to meet a schedule, to accommodate somebody, or because of your own personal interests. And I'm speaking of no particular instance. I'm speaking of an experience of instances where the idea that someone gets hurt, principally what we see, is because there hasn't been attention paid to risk and to hazard analyses and to the management of risk. And so what Ken and Kit have talked about really is we talk about preventative maintenance so much, like if you're running a business or if you're a yacht captain, preventative maintenance but risk management and the attention to risk ought to be given as much attention and ought to be on the forefront of everyone's mind, because it is really such a trigger to what then transpires and how we get involved. And so I think that when we talk about risk, it's got to be something that is such a driving force in the maritime legal world that I'm in. Now, there were a couple of things mentioned that I think strike to remind me of when we talk about professional captains, whether you're running your own small business or whether you're running a yacht or a commercial vessel of some sort. The safety management system, the SMS, that seems, my experience at times, it seems to lie dormant. There's not really attention paid to it. And we say there's not attention paid to it. Let's back up from safety management system. Some vessels are required to have it under their flag state. Some do it voluntarily, but it's an attempt to identify hazards, to identify risks, and treat them in the way Kent and Kit have talked about this evening. And in sharing some experiences we've had in this office, if you have a new chapter tomorrow, you want to pay attention to more risk, go to your safety management system. Ask yourself, when's the last time you spent time with that? Does the safety management system, does it marry up with, does it run parallel with what we're actually doing? Like contracts, which are often cut and copied from internet sources and then given to a lawyer after there's a dispute. SMS systems can be that way too. There might have just been an endeavor to grab an SMS system, put it in place, and run with it. And so, that was something that it really rung in my ear as Kit and Kent were talking. But let's talk about one other aspect here. We talk about risk and the outflow of what happens when attention is not paid to risk. There are consequences, and in the legal realm, you've got I guess you could categorize them maybe into four consequences. You've got your license, your Coast Guard license, or maybe you have a Royal Yachting Association type license, but whatever it is, that's going to be an issue. You're going to have, that if you have an incident, property damage of some sort or personal injury, you're going to have an investigation, hopefully, and that will impact your licensure, no doubt. You're also, as a professional captain, you in the U.S. you have exposure under a specific U.S. statute, which allows, quote, any person to sue a captain, mate, or crew who they believe caused their injury. And so that's like one of those little sleepers in the law that people don't realize exists out there. So what Kit can't say is really valuable because it might avoid a license issue. It might avoid personal liability when it comes to certain laws, one of which might be this U.S. Code section. I think then too, you've got the issue when we talk about consequences of liability for your employer, for the vessel owner that outflow from an incident. And I think Kent was talking about how exponential, while a claim may have a value, the maybe the unaccounted for value is often greater. And I probably share that belief, and that can be problematic. And then there's probably a fourth element, but I can't think of it right now. But when we talk about consequences, certainly there are those three that really stick in my head. We could mention wakes and all that, but we know that. License, your own personal exposure, and your exposure to your employer are the things that I think a professional captain should always be aware of. Now, I think we talk about professional boat captains. They're sort of a unique group. You have and I don't know if there's a good analogy, but it's an interesting group. And I'm looking at professional captains in the U.S. now. They are specialized in their training. They have licensure. They're given immense responsibilities, but there's a very loose association. There's really no, from my perspective, looking at the scenery, there's no cohesiveness. And that's why I think what Kit and others are doing here with this type of association is important, because you really, maybe the analogy is any other group that's licensed, that has a specialized skill set, that has a lot of responsibility, tends to have a lot more cohesiveness. And as a result, a lot more parity in the thinking, and as a result, an elevated safety awareness that one could argue is lacking in the current state of affairs. And so again, I applaud Kent Pitt for this and others for this effort. But I don't know, I'm probably pretty good at rambling, and I don't want to be rambling on and on. But I think when it comes to some thoughts from a maritime lawyer, none of which was legal advice, I have to throw that in, but which reflects some of my experiences. I think those are my comments.
John, let me, and John, those are great thoughts. And to the rest of the crowd, John and I have known each other for many years and worked together in various capacities for many years. And I have a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for just his depth of level of knowledge, but also how much thought he puts into it. It's one thing to know a lot. It's another thing to ponder what you know to maximize your output. So, John, let's say that, and Kit, we got to go back to picking on you for a minute, because that's the incident. That was the incident at hand. Let's say that the incident that Kit described actually led to like an actual injury. Okay, the woman actually broke her back as opposed to bumping it, right? And Kit is now in the hot seat. People are going to ask her questions, difficult questions. John, what sort of people? If you can answer this, what sort of people and questions and other things can she expect that might be very challenging to take, not just from a technical standpoint, but also from an emotional or ego standpoint? Does that make sense? Who's going to come ask her hard questions?
Well, hopefully somebody, because that sounds flippant, but it's not, because too often in cases in this office in which we represent injured claimants, one is gobsmacked by the fact that there was no follow-up, no debriefing, as Kit mentioned, no after-action report, a laissez-faire, disposable mindset. And that continues to surprise me, because both Kent and I were in an operation many years ago that really that put a lot of attention on personal responsibility, put a lot of attention on after-action. How did you mess up? tell me how you messed up so you don't mess up again. And I think that, you know, not to get away from your question, but I'm hoping that someone's going to ask your questions. Now, from a perspective of the questions a professional captain can be expected, the first that comes to mind in U.S. waters is going to be the 2692 form, the Coast Guard form, where there's going to have to be a statement under some circumstances as to what occurred. I would recommend, this is not legal advice, but I would recommend just general information here that any captain, before signing that, before agreeing to a narrative, speak to a lawyer, a maritime lawyer about that. And so you're going to have that 2692 form. You're going to have the captain making inquiries. You're going to have the flag state making inquiries potentially. I think the big thing though, and just one other, to bracket this with another off-topic comment, what Kit explained, the process that they went through, the safety meeting, the standby vessel, even if that woman was horribly injured, as tragic as that would be, what their endeavors did was it also created an environment that makes a plaintiff's lawyer who wants to tell a story to advance his client's injury to, you know, and show that there was real fault. It makes that story more difficult because what Kit's operation did was they did all the right things, assuming we understand the story. You know, they did everything right. So what you're doing is you're diffusing a situation. You know, you're saying we did as best we could here. We did have a safety meeting. We did have this. Because imagine what a jury sitting there thinks when I stand before them and say, and they didn't even have a safety meeting, or they had one and were chuckling about the potential risk. That you can see where that creates a totally different environment. So just the optics of what they went through, aside from the practicality of it actually making a difference, the optics also help. And I think that's important to remember.
Yeah. John, thanks for that. Kate, would you like to open up the floor to some questions from our participants?
Yeah, if anybody wants to unmute themselves and ask any questions, you're more than welcome. Or like I said in the chat, if you feel more comfortable sending them directly to any of us too, you can use that and we can talk about it. Does anybody want to unmute themselves and ask a question? Just go for it.
I know Tyson has a question.
Ask a question.
Tyson asked one in the chat, which I can do. Kit or Kent have any thoughts on breaking the error chain before the hazard happens?
So I do. I think it's a good concept. I years ago read a great article on Capt about the error chain being sort of force-fed in bridge resource management class, but not realistic. And then people talk about the Swiss cheese, and if the holes line up, then you have an incident. But you know, I would recommend. I'm sure if you go back through Capt, and he has error chain articles that I liked and that I bought into. But I have always believed in that, in something that you've probably heard me sort of talk about in the classroom is, you know, you can have one problem and no big deal, and another and you get a third problem, and once those three stars align, that's sort of the gateway to trouble. And I think, Tyson, that's what you're talking about with the error chain. And you know, the trick is you need to remove one of the links, take the lowest hanging fruit, and try to manage it more aggressively or more appropriately. But before you can do that, I think the real trick and what the real takeaway for this group is, you have to be able to see it. You have to realize what's going on, and you have to get it. You have to be able to identify the problem before you can eliminate it. And I see so many problems that have led to an incident where people didn't realize the problem existed in the first place. And then they're like, well, geez, it happened so fast. It didn't happen fast. You didn't see it. You didn't see it coming. So does that answer your question, Tyson?
And I think that also comes back to situational awareness, right? I mean, it's proactive thinking, it's looking around you, it's being alert and stopping that chain of errors before it can ever happen. I mean, that's the ideal goal in my mind.
True. John, anything to add to that that thought, or your thoughts on the error on the error chain from your operational days or your legal days? No.
No, I don't have anything, and I don't have anything that I feel will be productive to lend to that what you kid have already contributed there.
There is a question for John, though, that basically, if you have a small chartering business and you have your guests sign a liability form, does that cover you?
Well, I mean, just first of all, it's good that you're doing that because it suggests that you're paying attention to concepts about liability and risk. I think are two they ride together, right? And so you've got to be thinking about risk means liability. So, but to answer when you say to cover you, what I'm assuming is, does that relieve you of fault? And we're just talking very generally here. All right, this is not legal advice, but liability releases vary from state to state, their effectiveness, and they vary under the and the maritime law as well has its own view on releases. Releases also depend on the circumstances. By way of if someone signs something without appreciating what they're signing because of your fault, meaning the presenter's fault, then that's going to be difficult to uphold. If your conduct, and broadly speaking here, was reckless, if it raised that level, and I'm going to be able to plead that. So when I file a complaint, if I know there's a liability waiver there, and I've spoken to my client, I think I have a colorable claim to argue this, I'll argue it's reckless. And your conduct was reckless, meaning that typically will get me over an initial threshold so that I can get into discovery, meaning exchange of document. I can get into the lawsuit with you on the theory that a recklessness, sort of generally speaking, in most jurisdiction will extinguish the effectiveness of a release. So, takeaway here: go find a maritime lawyer, ask him or her. You tell them first. Talk to them. Don't let you talk more than they should talk. Is the way it ought to work. And tell them what your operation's about and what you want and the kind of risks that worry you, because you're the one that knows your business the most. You might realize, I don't really have a risky business except when I'm getting people on and off. So that maritime lawyer might be able to help you get a release or a notice even or something to help mitigate, which goes back to what Kent talked about, mitigate risk. So that's my long-winded answer.
The most unpredictable too, right, is the human being, right? It's the customer. The crowd control is always the hardest part of the job. People
Sure.
are unpredictable. People are unreliable. We joke, in all of these years I have spent on Narragansett Bay, sort of doing a relatively difficult job. You would think I would feel quite comfortable out there and I wouldn't be afraid of anything, right? The only thing I'm really afraid of is recreational boaters, right? Because they're unpredictable, because I don't know what they're going to do next. And you know what? Passengers are the same. Passengers are the same way. And people will come to us and say, I'd like to get a launch tender license. I'm not really doing anything. It's not that important. I'm not even going to be more than 1,000 feet from shore. It's not a big deal. Stop. It is a big deal. As soon as you put one person on your boat, for hire especially, it's a big deal.
Yeah.
Any other questions from the crowd? If you want to unmute and ask while we're here, I would certainly love to hear from you. We'll try our best to give you a great answer.
Yeah, good evening, Kent, John.
Hey, Jeff.
Yeah, hey. So, Kent, when you did your safety brief, did you document it?
In that particular incident, no. I mean, we were doing these landings, 3 times a day, 4 times a day sometimes. So we didn't, and I don't know, maybe we should have. Maybe even more accountability would be to have a form or a checklist or some kind of standard protocol that you're going through. We were not operating at that level.
Yeah. So, John, we do safety briefings all the time, especially if it's a salvage case involving the Coast Guard. And circle up, we have a pretty much assigned tasks, kind of go over all the risks and everything. but it's not documented. So what's your advice? Again, I know these are it's difficult to pull out paper and write and all that, but the Coast Guard really doesn't even document. They sit there, they nod their heads and thumbs up, have at it. So what do you suggest?
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't have any advice. I'm not giving advice. Forgive me for saying that, but there's some practical things I
got plenty
have
of
to say.
advice for you when John's done talking, actually.
But what I have are some thoughts. It cuts both ways. If you document everything, well, from a liability exposure, from a plaintiff's lawyer like myself, that might be good. It might be bad for me. I don't know. But you could see where if you always document something, then you don't document that instance. Well, that's the problem for potentially. If you document everything, well, maybe I could look at the documentation and say, well, you didn't cover X, Y, and Z. So that there's a lot of moving parts there. And again, and I don't want to go find any maritime lawyer who kind of knows his or her salt. And again, talk to them about what you're doing, your concerns, and how best to set up a protocol that you can say, okay, this is what we do. We do it, always do it this way. And in your instance, I mean, it might be, look, that's our protocol. That's what we do. We did it that time. Maybe that works for you. But that's really the best I can say, because some of these questions are really specific to your circumstances and to what you're encountering and what your risks might be. So
I should say best management practice, not advice. We'll go that route.
Yeah.
Yeah. From my perspective, we have a group of Cap, most of everybody's licensed. There are a few deckhands when we have these briefings. Everybody's chiming in and all that. So I would think if there was an incident and say they were deposed or anything, the stories will be consistent throughout the 5, 6, 7 involved. Generally, these briefings prevent that from happening. There's always a little bit of, such as Kit's situation where it happens.
yeah.
So,
But I mean, again, the optics there for you are good.
Right.
Just on and this is salad dressing in any kind of lawsuit. But again, it's just talking like the optics are good because you did have a safety meeting. So at least you're starting off on a good foot, I would argue.
Jeff, I might add that, and John may very well argue with me here, but I'm a big fan of recording what's happening. If nothing else, first of all, you're going to be on your best game because there's going to be a video of it. But second of all, even if you're wrong, even if you've made a mistake, the truth is going to come out. It eliminates a lot of the he said, she said. And I believe when I started driving, but and it can be a bad thing. I agree, but I believe that business was bettered when we began operating vessels on film, and particularly your level of liability as you deal with such a broad range of customers. Maybe you would spend $5,000 on body cameras for your captains. You could easily save that.
Yeah, we do that. Most of the time, the briefs are on the boats, which is recorded. We have the cameras on our vessels. But in the parking lot or on the dock at a dockside sinker, that is a very good. I mean, we document everything else. We just don't document the safety briefing. You got pictures, video, and everything else. If I could share a quick story, I don't want to take up too much time, but we did have an incident and a Coast Guard investigation, which I'll say luckily never went very far, but the fact that we had the SMS and a really smart maritime attorney gave me some advice on an after action for our captain, even though I'm going to say it wasn't his fault, but there is always that percentage of his fault. But the fact that we put him through your risk management class after the incident really struck a real good chord with the Coast Guard. I haven't heard from him, nor has my captain since the incident.
Good.
So if that after action was huge, and thanks, John. So
That's good. Yeah, Jeff, thanks for that. And thanks for that feedback. You know, we're here to help. We want it and we want to, right? And we want to leave that avenue open. Other questions from anybody? Just give me a second here to scroll through some chats, or just unmic and unmute and speak up if you like. We're coming up on the 1 hour mark, so I make a brief pause and then I bet you like, oh, no more questions. It sounds like we've covered most of them. So I do have Ed, did you have any parting thoughts? I have one final thought that I want to just put out there last for everybody to take away with them. But did you have anything you wanted to?
No, and thanks, Kent, but
Ed
definitely
wants
really
you
good
to join the
content.
Professional Captains Association tonight if you haven't already. I'll tell you that that's what he's about to say, and I hope you do too.
Yeah, yeah, please join, of course. Procaptains.org.
Okay.
All the info you need right there.
Good. Eric in the chat had brought up a concept that I like to talk about and is directly related to risk management, and I wanted to just leave it. It's a concept that I talk about regularly in a lot of my different courses, and it's called "What's your headline?" Right? And I mentioned that you're only as good as your last job, right? But stop and spend your day worrying about what your headline is, because you know, as a professional boat captain, particularly, people love stories about boats. I mean, you know, nowadays the news will do anything for any story. But what we, you know, Pam, if you have a collision on that boat with that customer that signed that waiver, your legal liability might be, you know, it might be positively impacted because you've got a good. But the news, it's going to destroy you, right? The public perception, and that worries me. You know, the risk of you know the risk of litigation is hazardous, but it's the reputation, it's the internet, it's the misconstrued information by the uninformed viewer that does a lot of damage. And so one day as I went to work, I just the thought of, you know, what's my headline, right? And what's my headline now? Well, you know, professional boat captain helps start trade organizations to help other professional boat captains, is going to finish a seminar and go and feed his children. Okay, that's a headline I can totally live with, right? Well, we're out of milk, so I'm going to drive to the store and I'm going to buy a gallon of milk. And on the way to buy a gallon of milk, my wife sends me a text message and says, "Get a loaf of bread." And I say, "Okay." And I plow into the minivan in front of me. What's my headline? Right? Boat captain plows into minivan, kills family. They don't tell you all the other stuff. And that's something that you should take into consideration when you're operating your boat. I've been in a position to read a lot of headlines, most of them fictitious, but all of them negatively impacting you in your career, sometimes permanently, right? And so I often like to say, well, you know, what's my headline? Because the reality is, no matter how good of a person you are one bad decision away from the ACI. Not just because you're a boat captain, but since we're all talking collectively as boat captains, we'll point at you there, but you're really only one bad decision away. So I don't mean that to be daunting. I mean that to be enlightening, and hopefully you take it with you as a defensive operation tactic. You know, when you go to work tomorrow, or when you're getting ready to do something work, think about that headline and what your headline can be. I hope that this has been valuable for all of you. We enjoy putting this together. We're incredibly thankful for Kit and John to both have invested time in us this evening to help with all of that. And I certainly enjoyed it. I'm so appreciative that all of you have joined us, and I enjoy seeing all of your faces, or if just your names out there. So thanks so much for coming. If you are looking for us or you have anything further, feel free to email us, or you can stick around. If I see people sticking around in a couple minutes, I'll unmute them and we can have some casual conversation if you want. But let's sign the seminar off so those of us that have other things to do with their evening can get going.